Hey guys, Jonty Hickman here. Welcome to my channel. In today's video, I want to speak about something that almost everybody experiences at some point during this recovery process. Your pain goes away, maybe for a few days, maybe for a few weeks, maybe for a few months, and then one day it comes back. Or perhaps the pain disappears from one area of the body and suddenly shows up somewhere else in the body. When this happens, it's very common to panic. People immediately start wondering what they've done wrong. They start thinking maybe they're back to square one, maybe the whole process has stopped working, maybe they've relapsed, maybe they were fooling themselves all along. If that's where your mind has gone recently, you're not alone. As always, in this video, I'm going to break this down into a few different sections. I want to speak about why pain can come back, why symptoms sometimes move around the body, why it often isn't the problem people think it is, and most importantly, what I think you should do when this happens. So let's start with what I think is the biggest misunderstanding in all of this. So the first thing I want to say is that pain coming back does not necessarily mean you've done something wrong. I know that's where your mind may immediately be going. The symptom appears and within seconds there's a story. Oh no, here we go again. I thought I was getting better. Maybe this is never going to end. Maybe I've gone backwards in some way. What I want you to notice is that all of those thoughts are interpretations. They're not necessarily facts. Usually what's happened is that the symptom has appeared, fear has shown up in response to it, and then the mind has immediately started creating a narrative about what the symptom means. We mistake the fearful story for the reality. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that because symptoms have returned, all of the progress they've made beforehand somehow no longer counts. They'll say, my pain was gone for 6 months and now it's back, or they'll say, I had 3 really good weeks and now I'm struggling again. Sometimes it wasn't even that long. Sometimes it was only a few good days that you had and now the pain's back. I've worked with plenty of people where recovery looks like 1 good day, 1 bad day, 3 good days, 2 difficult days, then another good week. It can look messy. Symptoms can disappear and come back. They can reduce in intensity and then increase again. They can move around the body. None of that automatically means something has gone wrong. The important thing isn't how long the symptom disappeared for. The important thing is that something is changing. If symptoms are moving, fluctuating, changing intensity, appearing and disappearing, that often tells us that things are recalibrating. Healing is often much messier than people expect it to be. A lot of people interpret pain returning as proof that they've relapsed. They assume they're right back where they started, but I think that's also usually the wrong way to think about it. If you've had symptoms for 10 years and then suddenly experienced a few symptom-free days, something has changed. If you've had symptoms for years and now they're moving around instead of staying fixed in one place, something has changed. If you've had symptoms that used to feel permanent and now they're fluctuating, something has changed. The symptom returning doesn't erase the evidence that progress has already occurred. I think people get into trouble because they see healing as a pass or fail test. Either I'm healed or I'm not. Either it's working or it's not. Either I'm doing this correctly or I'm doing it wrong. But that's not really what's happening here. We're learning a completely different relationship with our emotional world and with our bodies. We're learning a different relationship with fear, a different relationship with uncertainty, a different relationship with symptoms, a different relationship with our bodies. That isn't something that happens overnight. It's something that develops gradually over time, often through experiences that initially look like setbacks. Which brings me to something that might sound a bit strange. I actually think setbacks are necessary. They're not unfortunate, they're necessary. Because one day in the future, you'll probably have some sort of symptom appear in your body and you won't immediately perceive it as a setback anymore. You'll notice it, you'll acknowledge it, you'll maybe become curious about it, but you won't automatically think it's a disaster. You won't automatically think you're back to square one. You'll simply recognize that something is asking for your attention. People often think that they can get to that place of indifference by forcing themselves to get there. That's not what happens. You become more indifferent because you've experienced enough setbacks. You've seen enough symptoms come and go. You've watched enough flares arrive and then disappear again and again that eventually your system starts learning something new. Your system starts learning that symptoms are not necessarily emergencies. It starts learning that fear does not always need to be obeyed. It starts learning that discomfort is survivable. And over time, your relationship with symptoms changes because you've seen enough evidence that they don't always mean what you thought they meant once upon a time. So while you're in this stage of recovery, where every flare still feels catastrophic, that's okay, but it also tells us something. It tells us that fear is still asking for your attention. Fear is still asking to be felt. Fear is still asking for emotional availability. As long as pain returning feels like a disaster, there is still something for you to learn about being with fear. There's still something for you to learn about uncertainty. There's still something for you to learn about an emotional experience that arises when symptoms return. That's one of the reasons setbacks are part of the process itself. So, let's get into some reasons why pain can come back. So, the first possible reason that pain can come back is that something has been happening in your life. Now, I want to be careful here because I don't want everybody watching this video to suddenly become obsessed with finding some reason in their life that why pain is happening. But sometimes there is a reason. Maybe something has been happening to you at work recently. Maybe something happened in your relationship. Maybe there's been conflict. Maybe there's been rejection. Maybe there's been uncertainty. Maybe there's been disappointment. Maybe there was an event that created a bigger emotional reaction than you're used to allowing. Now, when people hear that, they often start looking for huge events. They start thinking there must be some major trauma or some enormous life event. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes it's just a conversation. Sometimes it's just an email. Sometimes a small disappointment can create a surprisingly large emotional response inside. What's important isn't necessarily how big the event is. What's important is the emotional response that's occurring inside your system. The event may be small from the outside, but huge from the perspective of your nervous system. That's the part that often people miss. Let's use anger as an example because I think this explains it really well. Imagine something is happening in your life and the situation naturally triggers 8 out of 10 anger. Not mild irritation or frustration, real anger. The sort of anger that wants you to scream. The sort of anger that wants you to rage. The sort of anger that wants you to destroy a room in your imagination. But because you've spent your life teaching your nervous system that only 4 or 5 out of 10 anger is acceptable, you've learned that mild frustration is okay. You've learned that polite anger is okay. You've learned that socially acceptable anger is okay. But you've never really taught yourself that bigger versions of anger are safe also to be with. Now there's a mismatch. Life is asking for you to accept 8 out of 10 anger, 8 out of 10 anger, but you've only taught your nervous system that 4 out of 10 anger is okay. The same can happen with fear, the same can happen with sadness, the same thing can happen with grief. Life is presenting an emotional experience at one intensity, but you've only developed the capacity to allow a much smaller version of it. Symptoms can arise because the nervous system is trying to get your attention, not because you failed, not because you've done something wrong, but because there's an emotional experience asking for more space than you've historically been willing to give it. In many ways, that's what this whole process is about. Expanding your capacity to be with emotions that previously felt too uncomfortable, too scary, too irrational, or too overwhelming. Recovery often involves teaching your nervous system that bigger emotional experiences are safe to feel. Now, here's where things can get really interesting. Sometimes people say to me, John T, nothing has been happening in my life. Nothing is stressful is happening. Nothing major is happening. My life is actually okay. So why have my symptoms come back? This is one of the most confusing parts of the process because people expect emotions to be logical. They expect emotions to make sense. They expect emotions to be tied to something happening in their life right now. But often, that's not how this works. Sometimes sadness wants to be here. Sometimes grief wants to be here. Sometimes fear wants to be here. Sometimes jealousy. Sometimes longing. Sometimes disappointment wants to be here in the mind and body. And because we spent so much of our lives talking ourselves out of emotions, we don't even realize we're doing it anymore. The feeling appears, and immediately another part says there's no reason to be feeling this. This doesn't make sense. This isn't helpful. This is irrational. This is disproportionate. Why should I be feeling this? And because that process has become so automatic, the emotion never really gets the opportunity to fully express itself. The feeling arises, and then the explanation arrives. The feeling arises and the analysis arrives. The feeling arises and the justification arrives. Over and over and over again. We become so skilled at talking ourselves out of emotional experience that we often don't even realize we're doing it. This is one of the reasons symptoms occur in the first place. They're interrupting that habit. They're interrupting the pattern of constantly moving away from the experience. They're interrupting the pattern of trying to solve emotional problems from the mind. I think one of the biggest things people miss is this. The mind says that the emotion doesn't make sense, but the body says, I don't ask whether it made sense. I ask whether this emotion is allowed. It's a completely different question. Many people spend years trying to determine whether an emotion is justified, whether it's reasonable, whether it's logical, whether it's proportionate, whether it's helpful. But our nervous system doesn't care about any of that. The nervous system is asking whether the emotional, it's not asking whether it's rational, it's asking whether the emotion is allowed. Once you start understanding that distinction, the whole process begins to look very different. Instead of asking, why am I feeling this? You start asking, can I allow myself to feel this? Instead of asking whether this emotion is correct, you start asking whether this emotion is welcome. This, of course, is where meditation becomes an antidote to everyday life, and I really mean that. Everyday life requires us to be civil, to be polite, to be productive. It requires us to keep moving forward. We've normalized all of that to the point where it feels completely natural to do so. But what everyday life requires and what the nervous system requires are often very different things. The nervous system sometimes wants us to feel rage. The nervous system sometimes wants us to feel grief. It wants us to feel jealousy. It wants us to allow the presence of despair. The nervous system sometimes wants us to feel deep, deep terror. And because we've learned that those emotions aren't acceptable in everyday life, we become incredibly skilled at talking ourselves out of them. Meditation becomes the place, the safe place, where the body finally gets permission to experience what everyday life constantly interrupts. It's the place where irrational emotions are allowed. It's the place where disproportionate emotions are allowed. That's why I often say meditation isn't always relaxing. Sometimes it's peaceful, sometimes it's beautiful, but sometimes, often, it's deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes meditation is where you sit with 8 out of 10 fear. It's where you sit with 9 out of 10 grief. It's where you're shaking. Sometimes meditation is where you're deeply crying. Sometimes it's where you're thinking, this is terrifying. And I actually think that's worth celebrating in meditation because it means something real is happening. It means you're no longer spending the entire meditation talking yourself out of your experience. You're finally allowing yourself to be with what the nervous system has been asking for all along. So, next I want to talk about why symptoms move around the body, why healing isn't linear, what people commonly do when pain comes back, and exactly what I think you should do when you're in the middle of this flare. So, let's talk about why pain moves around the body. One of the other things that people often experience during this process is that the pain doesn't just come back, it can come back somewhere else. Maybe your back pain disappears and suddenly your neck starts hurting. Maybe the headaches settle down and then your stomach starts acting up. Maybe one symptom goes away and then another symptom appears somewhere completely different. This is incredibly common and it can be really confusing when it happens. People often feel relieved that one symptom has disappeared only to panic again when another one shows up. They think, great, now I've got a whole new problem to deal with. There are lots of theories about why symptoms appear in different parts of the body. You might hear people say that throat symptoms relate to self-expression, stomach symptoms relate to control, or that different areas of the body correlate with different emotional themes. Now, sometimes those observations can be interesting and sometimes they can even feel quite accurate to our life. The only danger with that is if we become so focused on figuring out the symptom that we forget to be with the symptom. We become detectives. We spend all of our time trying to work out why it's in one location instead of another. And while that can be intellectually interesting, it can also become another way of solving the experience from the mind rather than just being in the body. One of the biggest things I've learned through this work is that the body isn't necessarily asking you to understand it. The body is asking you to be with it. It's a very different thing. The body isn't always asking you to solve the puzzle, it's asking you to develop a relationship. So if a symptom moves somewhere else, my first question isn't what does this location mean? My first question is, how do I feel about the fact that it moved? Do I feel afraid, frustrated, hopeless, angry? That's where the real work begins. Which brings me to something else that I think is very important. Healing isn't linear. It was never meant to be linear. A lot of people come into this work hoping they'll find the root emotion, feel it once, and then carry on with their lives. But that's not really what's happening. What you're actually doing is you're learning a completely different way of relating to yourself. You're learning how to become more emotionally available in situations where previously you would have become controlling, perfectionistic, analytical, or even avoidant. In many ways, who you are when you begin this journey and who you are when symptoms stop being the center of your life are two different people. Not completely different people, but different enough. The perfectionistic parts will soften, the people-pleasing parts soften, the controlling parts will also soften. I sometimes hear people describe this as an ego death. Personally, I think ego adjustment is probably a better phrase because it's not really that these parts of you disappear, it's more that they change. The part of you that believes fear is dangerous starts changing. The part of you that believes sadness is dangerous also will start to change. That can take time. It takes time for those parts to trust the process. It takes time for those parts of you to trust you. It takes time for those parts to stop believing that every difficult emotion is a threat. So when symptoms come back and part of you immediately says, we're back to square one, I want you to remember that there may be another part learning something completely new. There may be another part adjusting to a way of living that doesn't revolve around avoiding discomfort. Let's talk about what people will commonly do when symptoms return. So maybe you can relate to this. The first thing many people do is start monitoring symptoms again. They start checking, start scanning, start testing. They start paying attention to every little sensation in the body and constantly asking themselves whether things are getting better or worse. It's normal to do this. Then you start figuring everything out. Maybe I'm doing the process wrong. Maybe I didn't meditate properly. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I need another book. Maybe I need another technique. Maybe I need some other answer. If you're doing mind-body work, you may often go back to reading testimonials and watching success stories. Start watching videos for reassurance. Start trying to work out exactly why this is happening. I mean, that's probably why you're watching this video. If you're not doing mind-body work, you may start wondering whether you need surgery after all, medications after all, or some completely different explanation. I want to be really clear that I'm not calling any of these things mistakes. It makes perfect sense that you'll be doing this. If you're scared and symptoms have returned, of course you're going to look for certainty. Of course you're going to look for answers. The important thing is recognizing that these behaviors are often attempts to reduce fear rather than actually being with fear. So let's go on to what I think you should do when symptoms actually return. Let's get to the main piece of this. The first thing I would say is you don't immediately need to launch yourself into some huge emotional processing session. Sometimes people hear this work and they think the moment symptoms return, you should sit down and process everything immediately. I mean, you can if you want. Sometimes that's appropriate and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the first thing that you may need is care. Sometimes what you first need is support. Sometimes what you need first is a little bit of breathing room. Before you ask what you should do, I think it's worth asking, what do I actually need right now? Not what the perfect healer would do, not what everyone else would do. What do I need right now? One of the reasons I think this question is so important is because people often turn healing into another perfectionistic project. They think there must be a perfect response. They think there must be a correct answer. So there may be times when symptoms return and what you need isn't immediate emotional processing. What you need is a bit of TLC, tender loving care. Maybe you need an early night, maybe you need a bath, maybe you need to spend some time in nature, maybe you need to speak to a friend or a mentor. Sometimes you need to stop pushing yourself so hard for a few days. Sometimes you simply need reassurance. Sometimes you need rest. Sometimes you need somebody to remind you that you've been here before and you'll probably get through it again. I think people sometimes feel guilty about this. They think if they were doing the work properly, they'd immediately sit down and meditate for an hour, but that's not always realistic. Sometimes you're not ready to sit with a 9 out of 10 fear. Sometimes you need a little bit of support and capacity first. That's completely okay. Emotional health is only one part of the picture. Physical health matters, mental health, spiritual health, community matters, rest matters. Okay. Once you've given yourself whatever support you need, a couple of days or a week or so, the next step is usually returning to the practices that helped you in the first place. That might be meditation, journaling, or some other form of emotional exploration, therapy or community. This is where we come back to one of the biggest ideas in the whole video, moving from the mind to the body. If you're having lots of thoughts about symptoms, lots of catastrophizing, lots of monitoring, and lots of fear, the question isn't whether those thoughts are true or not. The question is, what emotional experience are those thoughts pointing towards? If the thoughts are all fearful thoughts, then fear is asking for your attention. Instead of trying to solve the fear, can you feel the fear in the body? Instead of trying to analyze the fear, can you experience the fear? Instead of trying to convince yourself everything is okay, can you allow yourself to be with what's actually here right now? That's often where the real work begins. We stop trying to solve emotional experiences from the mind and start learning how to experience them through the body. That's what your mind and body is asking you for. So what does it mean to feel an emotion in the body? One of the biggest questions people ask at this point is, what does it actually mean to feel an emotion in the body? People understand the theory. They understand that catastrophizing thoughts are usually fear. They understand that symptom monitoring is usually fear. But then they sit down to meditate and think, okay, now what do I do? They know they're supposed to move from the mind to the body, but they don't actually know what that means. They don't know whether they're doing it correctly or not. The first thing I'd say is that anything above about a 7 out of 10 emotional experience is usually best explored in some sort of dedicated space, a meditation, a therapy session, a journaling practice, somewhere emotions are allowed to get very big if they need to get very big. If fear wants to show up as terror, let it be terror. If anger wants to show up as rage, let it be rage. If sadness wants to show up as despair, let it be despair. That's one of the reasons these dedicated spaces exist. Now, when you're sitting there and you're noticing catastrophizing thoughts or symptom monitoring, the first step is simply recognizing that some sort of emotional experience is present. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's frustration, maybe hopelessness, maybe uncertainty. And then instead of continuing to follow the thoughts, you gently ask yourself a different question. How is my body feeling right now in the midst of these thoughts? It's important to understand that there isn't one correct answer to that question. Sometimes a lot is happening in the body. Maybe there's tightness in the chest. Maybe there's a lump in the throat. Maybe there's tears coming up. Maybe there's shaking in the legs. Maybe there's some sort of restlessness. But sometimes there isn't much happening at all in the body. Sometimes you feel numb. Sometimes you feel disconnected. Sometimes you feel bored. Sometimes it feels like absolutely nothing is happening, and that's also okay. In fact, for some people, that's the most uncomfortable part. They've convinced themselves that healing should look dramatic. They think it should be big tears, shaking, raging, or having some huge breakthrough, release, completion. But sometimes the practice is simply staying with what's there. Sometimes it's staying with numbness. Sometimes it's staying with boredom. Sometimes it's staying with uncertainty. Sometimes it's sitting with the fact that it's just you and the symptoms and not much else seems to be happening. What we're really doing in our meditation is bringing our attention to the body and staying there, not trying to change the experience, not trying to calm it down, not trying to make something happen, just staying with what's already there. One of the things you'll probably notice is that parts of you will come in and try and self-soothe. They'll try to relax the breath. They'll try and calm you down. They'll try and reassure you. They'll try and solve the uncertainty. They'll try to get you away from the discomfort of boredom or numbness. Part of meditation is noticing those habits and gently stepping back from them. It's recognizing that you don't actually have to fix the experience. You don't have to make the fear go away. You don't have to make the numbness go away. It's okay for us to feel afraid. It's okay for us to feel confused. It's okay for us to feel uncertain. It's okay for us to feel like we're doing it wrong and to just be in the body with that. It's okay for the body to feel restless. It's okay for the body to feel numb. It's okay for whatever is here to simply be here. Ultimately, that's what we're practicing. We're teaching the nervous system that it doesn't need to immediately move away from the discomfort. Whether the experience is incredibly intense or nothing much seems to be happening at all, the task remains the same. Stay with the body. Stay with the experience. Allow it to be exactly as it is. And if all of that still feels confusing, that's completely understandable. It's one of the reasons support can be so valuable. Sometimes another person in front of you can help you identify what's actually happening in your body and help you understand what it means, how to stay with the experience instead of automatically trying to fix it. One of the reasons people struggle with this process is because they think emotions should feel manageable. They think if they're doing it correctly, they'll feel a little bit of sadness, a little bit of fear, a little bit of anger. But what if what's coming up for you is 9 out of 10 fear? What if what's coming up for you is a lot of rage? What if what's coming up for you is despair? That's often where people start believing they're doing something wrong. In reality, that may be exactly what the nervous system has been trying to show you. If you've only ever taught your nervous system that 4 out of 10 fear is safe, then 9 out of 10 fear is going to feel terrifying. That's what 9 out of 10 fear is meant to feel like, terrifying. The thoughts will say we're going to die. This is terrible. This is never going to end. Everything is falling apart. That's the language of intense fear. That's what fear sounds like. The goal isn't to convince that fear that it's wrong. The goal is to allow yourself to experience the fear that's already there. Sometimes that means you're going to shake. Sometimes it means you're going to cry. Sometimes it means you're going to feel really overwhelmed in the experience. Everything about that experience can feel wrong. If you spent your life trying to move away from fear, then sitting with fear intentionally can feel completely backwards. It's why guidance can be so valuable. This is one of the reasons I don't think this work was ever really intended to be done completely alone. We've become very focused on independence and self-sufficiency. While there's value in that, I think human beings are also designed for support. We're designed for connection. One of the reasons I created my community and one of the reasons I work with people directly is because sometimes we need somebody else to help us hold space for an experience that feels too big or confusing or wrong. If you're trying to sit with 9 out of 10 fear and you've only ever learned how to sit with 5 out of 10 fear, that's very difficult. That's where support becomes valuable, not because you're failing, not because you're weak, but because you're human. Sometimes another person can help us stay present with an emotion that feels overwhelming. Sometimes another person can help us understand what it means to move from the mind into the body. They can help us understand what to do with nothingness and numbness. Before we finish, I want to come back to something I said near the beginning, just to summarize. Pain returning for you does not erase the progress that you've already made. If you've had 3 symptom-free days, that matters. If you've had 3 symptom-free weeks, that matters. If you've had 6 symptom-free months, that matters. If symptoms have moved around, that matters. If symptoms have become less intense, that matters. If symptoms are fluctuating when they used to feel fixed, that matters. All of those things are evidence that something has shifted. The flare doesn't erase the progress. The flare is simply the next chapter in the process. I think this is one of the most important things I can leave you with. Many people accidentally create a new perfectionistic goal. They decide that healing means never experiencing symptoms again. They decide that success means symptoms disappearing forever. But I don't think that's really the goal. The goal is emotional availability. The goal is learning how to be with fear. The goal is learning how to be with sadness. The goal is learning how to be with anger. The goal is learning how to be with uncertainty. As that relationship changes, symptoms often become less important, not because they've disappeared immediately, but because they stop feeling like emergencies. You stop seeing them as proof that something has gone wrong and start seeing them as information. Eventually, symptoms become less and less of a threat and more of a signal. So if your pain has gone away and come back, I don't want your first conclusion to be that you failed. I mean, it may very well be, that's why you're watching this video. Sometimes something is happening in your life and your emotional capacity is catching up with what life is asking for you. Sometimes nothing obvious is happening in your life and emotions are simply trying to move through your system. Sometimes emotions move around the body because the body is still asking for your attention. Sometimes symptoms return because healing was never meant to be a straight line in the first place. Whatever the reason, the practical response remains remarkably similar. Take care of yourself, get support if you need it, stop trying to solve everything from the mind, learn how to return to the body, return to the emotions, and return to the practice. Very often, pain coming back is simply showing you where emotional availability is still being learned. It's showing you where the next layer of growth is. It's showing you where the next layer of healing is. If you'd like more support with meditation, journaling, emotional processing, chronic symptom recovery, you can join our pain relief community for free. You can find more details about it below in the caption. There is plenty of resources inside the community. If you have any questions about what I discussed today, please ask below in the comment section, anything that you'd like to share about your experience. I hope this video helped you. Like I said, much of what we're trying to learn is just ongoing emotional availability. Symptoms eventually become less and less of a threat as we move through this process, and eventually you find yourself with more and more symptom-free days. You find that much of this process is as much about becoming emotionally available to yourself as it is about learning to just get back to life regardless of symptoms. And at some point in the future, you arrive at a place of more indifference, not because you force yourself there, but because you're more used to being with emotions as they show up. You're not as bothered about sensations in the body. And that's when, going forward, a mix between someone becoming more emotionally available to themselves and more just resilient to just get on with life regardless, that's when symptoms become a thing of the past. That's when they're just no longer a part of your life anymore. Thanks for watching. Anything you'd like to share, like I said, please do so in the comments below or ask. Otherwise, hopefully hear from you soon.